welcome to today's online seminar hosted by the King's India Institute at King's College London. My name is Professor Louise Tillin and I'm Director of the King's India Institute. I'm delighted that we're getting together today for the first of our online event series for the new academic year. Today we are joined by a very eminent panel to discuss India in the Indo-Pacific, drivers and constraints. I will in a minute hand over to my colleague Professor Harsh Pant, who's going to moderate today's discussion, but I just wanted to begin by saying how glad I am that we are hosting this discussion today. The Indo-Pacific tilt in the foreign policies of many Western nations is receiving a lot of airtime at the moment. But I think we have not discussed enough the importance of these geopolitical shifts for India and the role of India indeed in shaping the Indo-Pacific. So today's event is the first of a series of conversations that we intend to hold around the role and foreign relations of India in the Indo-Pacific. And without further ado, I will pass to my colleague, Professor Harsh Pant, who is Professor in International Relations at the King's India Institute and also Senior Research Fellow at the Observer Research Foundation in New Delhi.
Thanks, Louise, and let me also take this opportunity on behalf of King's India Institute to welcome this very distinguished set of panelists, as well as the audience that is joining us for this first, as Louise mentioned, first in a series of conversations that this institute plans to hold over the next few months on India's role in shaping the idea of the Indo-Pacific in its operationalization, as well as in a wider conversation with other stakeholders in the Indo-Pacific. So I think, this is, it's a great privilege to be able to host such a distinguished panel for this very first conversation. And this conversation is focused primarily on the drivers and constraints. When we look at India and the Indo-Pacific, we are looking at a series of issues on the table at the moment that have the factors that have shaped India's response. Of course, the rise of China has made Indo-Pacific as the most important maritime strategic geography of our times, but it is also the response of countries like India and other nations in the region that have resulted in this wider acceptance of this concept across the board from the west to the east. So this is the endeavor here is to understand some of these drivers, as well as some of the constraints that still continue to operate when it comes to the operationalization of this idea in real terms. So that's the endeavor of this first discussion that we are hosting today. And we have a very distinguished set of panelists, which we will come to in a bit. But to begin with, we have Dr. Anupam Ray, who heads the Policy Planning and Research Division of the Ministry of External Affairs for his keynote address. He'll be laying out India's vision, Indian government's vision of what the idea of the Indo-Pacific entails and how it is being operationalized. And after that, we will come to a moderated panel discussion where I would also invite the audience to send in their comments, questions, observations using the Q&A tab at the bottom of the screen. So with that, let me invite Dr. Anupam Ray, who has had a very distinguished career as a diplomat, but he wears many hats. He was a physician, he has been an academic, and he also, at the moment, heads one of the most important divisions of the MEA. So Dr. Ray, the floor is all yours, and we look forward to hearing from you. Dr. Ray, you are muted.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Am I good to go? Thank you, Harsh, and thank you to King's College and the organizers for organizing this event and for giving me the opportunity to speak here. I'm a practitioner, so I'll be brief and hopefully and businesslike. I'll talk about things that we are doing and things that we have done, rather than discuss concepts and ideas. I'd like to begin, however, by saying that I count myself the idea of Indo-Pacific or the idea of this region has a very old history. I count myself lucky that I was able to visit the great temples of Angkor Wat in Cambodia. The magnificent ruins in the town of Siem Reap, far away from India, speak of a common cultural space that existed centuries ago. A few years ago, I came upon a book entitled Crossing the Bay of Bengal by Sunil S. Amrit that spoke of how the Bay of Bengal was once a region at the heart of global history. This book speaks of how it was forgotten in the second half of the 20th century, carved up by the boundaries of nation states, its shared past divided into separate compartments of national histories. Fast forward to 2018 and the Prime Minister's keynote address at the Shangri La Dialogue. In the clearest and the most authoritative exposition of our Indo-Pacific outlook to date, he began by saying that for thousands of years, Indians have turned to the east. He went on to describe the links between India and a geographical entity that is both land and ocean, and to which we are linked by land and sea bridges. This vast space extends from across the Pacific Rim to Southeast Asia, South Asia, the Gulf region, and all the way to the east coast of Africa. In this vast space, we are an Asian nation, we are a maritime nation, we are a trading nation, and we are a globalized nation. And we are located in the most economically dynamic region of the world that is driving what is referred to as rebalancing. For us, the Indo-Pacific concept, in the words of our External Affairs Minister, Dr. Jaishankar, represents Indo-Pacific, represents the reality of globalization, the emergence of multipolarity, and the benefits of rebalancing. Now, what does this region mean for us? To begin with, we have extensive economic interests. Last year, our bilateral trade with ASEAN was $87 billion, with China, $82 billion. With Japan and Korea together, it was $38 billion. With the United States, $88 billion. With Australia, around $13 billion. In the Indian Ocean region, our trade with Sri Lanka and Bangladesh together was around $15 billion. With the UAE and the Gulf, we traded about $59 billion worth of worth. With Saudi Arabia alone, it was $33 billion. This is the maritime space that connects Africa, Asia, Oceania, and the Pacific coast of the Americas, through which 50% of global trade passes. It is home to over 64% of the world's population and contributes to over 62% of global GDP. Therefore, for obvious reasons, this region is important for us not only regionally but globally. Now, what are the main elements of our outlook to this region? And here I can do no better again than to quote from the speech that was made by our Prime Minister, where he at the Shangri La Dialogue, and he said that the main elements of our outlook are a free, open, and inclusive order in the Indo-Pacific based upon respect for sovereignty and territorial integrity of all nations. Number two, peaceful resolution of all disputes. Number three, that disputes should be resolved through dialogue and adherence to international rules and laws. Number four, an Indo-Pacific which is inclusive in nature and supports an approach that respects the right to freedom of navigation and overflight for all on the international seas. Number six, the principle of ASEAN centrality. And number seven, an approach based on cooperation and collaboration, given the need for shared responses to shared challenges in the region. Prior to this, in 2015, we had also enunciated something called, we had also talked about Sagar. The Prime Minister announced it in Mauritius. Sagar is a sort of an eponym. It means ocean in Sanskrit. And it's an acronym for doctrine for security and growth for all in the region. Now that I've talked briefly about the region and its importance for us and our outlook to it, I'm going to put on my practitioner hat, and I'm going to talk of what we actually do there, the structures and programs. So to begin with, as a civil service or as a government institution, when you deal with an issue, you have to create the structures for it. And it might interest you to know that the only new territorial division that the Ministry of External Affairs has actually created in at least the last 2 decades, dealing on a bilateral, dealing on territorial issues, is the Indo-Pacific division. All other divisions have been bifurcated or merged, but this is the only new unit that we have created in quite some time. This unit was created in April 2019, and the purpose of doing so was twofold: to help consolidate India's vision of the Indo-Pacific across the government of India, in line with the elements set out by the Prime Minister, and to promote substantive policy inputs and programs that promote this vision. This division, and this gives you an idea of how we deal with it. The division deals with matters relating to the Indo-Pacific, India-ASEAN relations, East Asia Summit, Indian Ocean Rim Association, the Asia-Europe meeting, ASEM, Mekong-Ganga Cooperation, MGC, and the Irrawaddy Chao Phraya Mekong Economic Cooperation Strategy, ACMECS. And each of these configurations is important for us. Each of this configuration has its own trajectory, but we try to harmonize them into a larger Indo-Pacific strategy. Now, let me give you some specifics of how we deal with each of these configurations. With ASEAN, we have progressed from being dialogue partners to strategic partners over the course of 25 years. We pursue our relations through annual summits and 30 dialogue mechanisms. But even more than the shared vision of the region, there is the comfort and familiarity of our old links with this area. We are active participants in ASEAN-led institutions like the East Asia Summit, the ADMM Plus, and the ARF, the ASEAN Regional Forum. Outside or related to this region, we are a part of BIMSTEC. We are a part of the Mekong-Ganga Economic Corridor. And we use our, we have something called the Act East policy. We see the Act East policy as our gateway into the Indo-Pacific area. In 2019, Prime Minister Narendra Modi launched the Indo-Pacific Oceans Initiative, the IPOI, at the East Asia Summit held in Bangkok. It is an open global initiative in line with our idea of an open Indo-Pacific, and draws on existing regional cooperation architecture and mechanisms to focus on 7 central pillars, which are, and these are, they give you an idea of our operational focus. These are first and foremost maritime security, maritime ecology, maritime resources, capacity building and resource sharing, disaster risk reduction and management, science, technology and academic cooperation, and trade connectivity and maritime transport. So I think that gives you an idea of the pillars on which we build our, the sort of the actionable points of our agenda. We are also involved and have built stronger bonds with entities like the Pacific Islands Forum and the Pacific Alliance. So now that I've given you the pillars of how on which we base our action, we are, as I told you, I keep coming back to it. I'm a practitioner, and we know the old saying that an ounce of practice is worth, et cetera, et cetera. So let me talk specifically about what we have done in one particular sector, which will give you an idea of our intent, the resources we have brought to bear, and the focus we have on this issue. So I'm going to focus on the maritime domain. So let me begin with maritime information sharing and maritime domain awareness, where we have had, we are working very closely with partners like Sri Lanka, Mauritius, Maldives, and Seychelles on things like coastal radar surveillance systems. We have a large number of maritime dialogues within, and this number of dialogues is growing as we actively cooperate on sharing information and perception on maritime perspectives. We have maritime dialogues with Myanmar, Vietnam, Thailand, and Coast Guard dialogues with Malaysia and Indonesia. We work on things like hydrographic surveys, which are a very important aspect of maritime knowledge. We have Indian hydrographers have worked with Myanmar, Maldives, Mauritius, Seychelles, Mozambique, Sri Lanka, Tanzania, and Kenya on hydrographic surveys. We also run the Indian Ocean Tsunami Early Warning System in the National Center for Ocean Information Services in Hyderabad. Within the Indian Ocean framework, India works bilaterally and through IORA and other intergovernmental platforms in multiple initiatives that promote maritime security cooperation. These include anti-piracy operations, generation of standard operating procedures, promotion of interoperability, augmentation of the number and scope of joint activities, dialogues, and exercises, greater cooperation between navies and coast guards, and joint efforts to deal with human trafficking, narcotics, contraband, and weapons. And these are real operations. India works with the East Asia Summit to regularly hold East Asia Summit maritime security conferences. We have been conducting anti-piracy patrols in the Indian Ocean for the Middle East and Africa for more than a decade. You know, we have a large number of exercises to enhance joint capacities, and these exercises are growing. Some of these are the biennial multilateral exercises, which are Milan. We do HADR exercises. We do biennial search and rescue exercises and pollution response exercises. We have trilateral exercises with Singapore and Thailand, SITMEX. And we do something called DOSTI, which is an India, Sri Lanka, Maldives joint Coast Guard exercise. We have agreements with Myanmar, Thailand, and Indonesia on maritime coordinated patrolling. In another instance of maritime security cooperation, INS Sumedha, an offshore patrol vessel, has been made available for joint surveillance of the Maldivian EEZ. An Indian Dornier aircraft has assisted Mauritius in patrolling its EEZ. You might have seen about a recent agreement about an OBV2. India is active in combating maritime pollution in this region. We have participated and continue to participate in maritime SAR exercises and operations. We conduct something, we have participated in something called SARCOMEX with Oman, South Korea, Thailand, Vietnam, Bangladesh, Philippines, Indonesia, Sri Lanka, Malaysia, Myanmar, Qatar, and Australia. We have assisted in upgrading maritime security capabilities of our neighbors and partners. We have upgraded and assisted in acquisition of vessels and aircraft in respect of Vietnam, Mozambique, Maldives, Mauritius, Seychelles, Comoros, Bangladesh, and Myanmar. We also conduct training programs, workshops, and seminars on maritime security and have deployed mobile training teams to a number of nations. We promote the White Shipping Information Exchange. We have about these agreements with 22 countries. And we have created this International Fusion Center for the Indian Ocean region in Delhi, which our minister is fond of saying, it gives us the ability from the Straits of Lombok on one side to the Cape of Good Hope on the other. Let me now turn to HADR. We have an established reputation as a first responder in the region. This has come about because we've been active. In fact, the Quad is a big deal now. It's a talking point. And what many of us sometimes forget is that the Quad began essentially as a post-tsunami exercise in Sri Lanka in 2004. That is its origin. It's in HADR. India has also worked with Sri Lanka following Cyclone Rohan in 2016 and the floods in 2017. In 2015, Indian assets were deployed following the earthquakes in Nepal in Operation Maitri. Indian aircraft and naval vessels shipped supplies to Bangladesh in 2017 and 2018 after the influx of Rohingya refugees. It was called Operation Insaniyat. We have been prompt in extending assistance to Bangladesh and to Myanmar following natural disasters such as Sidr 2007, Nargis 2008, Thailand 2013, Mora 2017. During the pandemic, we moved HADR operations under the rubric of Operation Sanjeevani and also something called Mission Sagar, in which we deployed Indian assets to Maldives, Mauritius, Seychelles, Madagascar, and Comoros to supply food, COVID-related medications, including at that time hydroxychloroquine tablets, Ayurvedic medicines, and medical assistance team. On a larger frame, we have deployed HADR assets to deal with contingencies or with emergencies from as far apart as Bande in Indonesia. We went there in 2004. We went there again in 2018, up to Mozambique, all the way through Mauritius, Madagascar. So, we also have a record of conducting complex and demanding evacuation operations during humanitarian crisis. We have evacuated our nationals and those of some of our neighbors from Lebanon in 2006, and more recently from Libya in 2011 and Yemen in 2015 and 2018. So these are some of the things where we have actually shown, where we have worked on the ground to demonstrate our resolve, to demonstrate our capacities, to build programs which we can continue to build on. This is just one of the domains, which is maritime security. Before I finish, I would like to refer to some of our newer initiatives. You might be aware of the Quad Vaccine Initiative, which will be of immense help to Indo-Pacific countries. Based on our shared democratic values, the Quad has decided to move forward in areas such as this, which have a positive angle to it, a positive thinking and a positive approach. What about the future? The pandemic has made us, it's the greatest shock that we have faced, at least in our lives, in my life. And it has made us have a look at things in a different light, this is a time during which we were forced to take stock. And again, if you are to look to the future, I can do no better than to quote our minister. And he says that there are three issues that the pandemic has brought to the fore. One is the salience of health, the power of the digital, and the importance of rebuilding greener. Our vision for the Indo-Pacific in the future will incorporate these elements. The backbone, we have already talked of maritime security, securing, sharing maritime information, maritime domain awareness in this area. Things like high-speed internet, cybersecurity, enhanced digital literacy, deeper technical cooperation, regional e-commerce. All this, I think, will have a place in our conversations in the coming days. Thank you very much. Thank you, Harsh, for giving me this opportunity again. And I wish the panelists a useful and fruitful discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Ray, for giving us some very insider's account of what is actually happening on the ground, and also laying out in considerable detail, especially in the maritime space, perhaps all that is needed to be understood by those who are looking at the Indo-Pacific and India's role in the Indo-Pacific through a new lens. So thank you, and we are very grateful for you to be able to make this time, and please join us in the future as well if you have time. And with that, let me invite and let me introduce my very distinguished set of panelists who have given their time as well for this conversation today. And I have with me Ambassador Gurjeet Singh, one of the most distinguished diplomats and who has served as India's ambassador to countries like Germany, Indonesia, and the ASEAN. He knows the region inside out, and we will be talking to him about India's response to the concept of the Indo-Pacific and receptivity of this idea in the countries that he has served in. We have with us Indrani Bagchi, diplomatic editor, Times of India, one of the most influential reporters in India, if I may say so, and we will be talking to her about how Indian diplomatic community has come to terms with this idea of the Indo-Pacific, and how the structures, which I think Dr. Ray mentioned, how the changing structures of the MEA are responding to the new realities that confront us. We have with us Professor Shangri Sundaraman from JNU. She is, of course, she belongs to the Center for the Indo-Pacific Studies, and we'll be engaging with her on a conversation about the idea and where do we go from here in terms of our understanding of the concept as well as India's role in it. And finally, we have with us Rear Admiral Sudarshan Srikhande, one of the most interesting and influential naval thinkers in India at the moment, former head of Indian Naval Intelligence. And the aim would be with him to understand the maritime aspect of this concept and how do we look at some of the threats and challenges that are emerging from there. So with that, can I come to you, Ambassador Singh? because you have served, you have a long-standing, service as part of the Indian foreign policy establishment. And you have been part of the era where no one was talking about the Indo-Pacific. I mean, Dr. Ray talked about the ancient lineage of the term, but clearly its contemporary operationalization is something very new. And often it was said that India's focus traditionally has been on, and in India's focal point of Indian foreign policy had been centered on Indian Ocean region. But this idea of the Indo-Pacific is new in operational terms. And as we look at the future and as you look at the past, what differences do you see in this, and what kind of opportunities it gives a country like India that has played a very, very interesting and important role in shaping the discourse as well? It is not simply about India trying to do things, or India trying to, as Dr. Ray outlined, a number of things in the wider maritime space, but also this fact that if countries like India, Australia, and Japan had not responded to the imperative, to this imperative, perhaps the idea of Indo-Pacific would not have moved beyond the think tank circuit or the academic circuit. So as a practitioner, how do you look at this evolution in Indian foreign policy from pre-Indo-Pacific era to the post-Indo-Pacific era? So you are muted.
Yes, thank you, Professor Pal. And I'm very happy to have eminent panelists, my good friends today with me. So, I first encountered this region when I was in Japan on my second assignment around 1991. And as India announced the Look East policy, there was actually an Asia-Pacific concept growing. But that concept ended with Myanmar, and India was not part of it. And you can see that India is still not a part of APEC. So from that time, for India to be now the center of the Indo-Pacific is a long journey. With the creation of the East Asia Summit in 2005, India came into the Asia-Pacific conception. But we were on its fringes. But with the Indo-Pacific, the fulcrum moves to India. Thus, India, from being a peripheral power in the region, now is a central power to the region. I think this has to be clearly understood. Now, we also have to understand that our conception of the Indo-Pacific, as also the Japanese and the French for that matter, extends beyond India to the shores of East Africa, what Dr. Ray called the Indian Ocean, in an area where India is far more dominant than in the South China Sea. So that brings India into a much bigger focus with the concept of the Indo-Pacific. Secondly, Indo-Pacific concept, while dealing with India's strategic threats, of course, there's no hiding from the fact that the Chinese aggression in the South China Sea aggravated the early conceptualization of the Indo-Pacific concept. So besides Indo-Pacific dealing with India's strategic threat, it also projects India as a strategic partner worth its while. The strength of the Indian Navy, the lure of the Indian market, the manufacturing capacities, and India's growing capabilities from technology to vaccine production and the like, give India a larger importance in a wider Indo-Pacific than the economic liberalization provided in a Look East policy of 1990. The emphasis I want to place here is that the Look East policy was largely a come to me policy, whereas the Indo-Pacific policy is I am coming to you policy, big traversing the trough of the region. I was in Jakarta when Indo-Pacific started being debated in the East Asia Summit. And it was India, Indonesia, and Russia who actually had concept papers on it, including Russia, who today is allergic to the concept. That is because of the rise of China, which has pushed Russia into the periphery of the East Asia Summit instead of India. Now, we also have to see that India has not done itself any favors by being, left out of the trade arrangements which opened in the region. In fact, originally we joined the RCEP negotiations as a strategic option, but we failed to see it through. Now, the jury is still out whether the RCEP will succeed, because it is still not come into effect and may come into effect if enough ratifications are done by 1 January 2022. The China factor in RCEP was the key determinant for India's decision to leave. However, with the strategic conception of Indo-Pacific, more strategic alliances are emerging which are dealing with economy, technology, and other contemporary issues like big data, AI, 5G, and the like. Due to this, despite the absence from RCEP, India is seen as a strategic partner for resilient supply chains, as between Japan, Australia, and India, and among larger partnerships emanating with the EU, the UAE, Israel, Korea, and Australia, which had slowed down for a while. So, the one place where the Indo-Pacific concept causes some concern is in ASEAN. In 2019, they nevertheless came up with their own Indo-Pacific concept. But they note that India has stepped out of the need for ASEAN to criticize China to be friends with others. ASEAN loves this approach. They feel that they should be allowed to coexist with China and with us and other Quad members. This approach is now also followed by the Quad after their second summit. My final point is this, that India always wants to be at higher tables than it got at independence. Our entry into the UN Security Council and other places has been thwarted by China. The financial crisis in 2008, which led to the creation of the G20, got India a seat on that high table. But with the Indo-Pacific conception, it brings India to a higher table as in the Quad and to greater attention in the region, which now understands that realist policies rather than liberal policies are determining these things. And in this, India will always play a major role. And many of these things Dr. Ray has clearly delineated. I would stop there, Pawan. Thank you.
Thank you. I'll come to you, Professor Sundararaman, because Ambassador Singh pointed out the role of ASEAN, and Dr. Ray also pointed out that the issue of ASEAN centrality that India in its Indo-Pacific approach has always underscored from the Prime Minister's speech onwards. We have always seen this being underscored. How important that is for India, and how the challenge that ASEAN faces, as Ambassador Singh was pointing out, in terms of balancing multiple poles in the region. What does it mean for ASEAN's own internal cohesion when it comes to their own Indo-Pacific outlook, which they've tried to come up with a great degree of delicate balancing? But where do we go from here? Because there are lots of questions around that. And given India's focus on ASEAN, I think that is an important question for us to address.
Okay. Thank you so much at the outset to both the King's College as well as to you, Harsh, for asking me to be part of this. I think I'll start from where you sort of stopped with the ASEAN outlook on the Indo-Pacific per se. Now, I guess the momentum for an Indo-Pacific approach was extremely relevant because we've seen, if you take the two temporal junctures, I would say critical junctures were the entire, pivot to Asia policy that the Obama administration started, and the United States signing on to the EAS and coming into the framework of what is called the absence from Southeast Asia, a return to an ASEAN-led mechanism in that sense. And I think the second thing is another point that Ambassador Gurjeet Singh raised was on the South China Sea, because in 2012 on 11 itself, when you had the discussions on the limits of the continental shelf, you started to see the violations in the South China Sea. So it's very interesting that when we look at this and the fact that in the aftermath of COVID, we've seen a greater degree of multiple countries presenting their views and their approaches to the Indo-Pacific. I think it's very important, therefore, to highlight the ASEAN's role here and what the ASEAN-led mechanisms have been about. Now, if you take the ASEAN-led mechanisms, the actual raison d'etre, the reason for their existence probably came into greater focus in the aftermath of the Cold War ending, because ASEAN was able to expand its entire processes or mechanisms outwards. Now, having done that, there was this sense of, that ASEAN lies. I still recall there was a very interesting article in the Jakarta Post by the former Secretary General, Surin Pitsuwan, who said that ASEAN lies at the heart of Asia-Pacific multilateralism. And interestingly, this article must have come out sometime in January of 2012. And by July 2012, we saw that the ministerial conference, which could not come up with a joint communique on the South China Sea. So that heart of Asia-Pacific multilateralism was actually going probably through a heart attack at that point. And what is interesting is that the ASEAN had to sort of invent itself extremely quickly to the concept of what was happening in the region, which I don't think they have successfully managed to do even now. So having said that, let me sort of focus a little bit on what you raised about the ASEAN outlook on the Indo-Pacific. If you look at the outlook, and here I will compare it a little bit with what Ambassador Gurjeet raised on the Quad also to some extent. If you look at the outlook per se, the outlook actually promotes international law. It talks of a rule-based order for the Indo-Pacific region. However, it does not use the terminology Indo-Pacific anywhere in the outlook except the title. Okay, the actual reference that ASEAN makes is to a region that is called the Asia-Pacific and the Indian Ocean regions, and it talks in terms of an interconnectedness between these two regions. Now, it's interesting that ASEAN's outlook very clearly identifies that it seeks to work both with regional as well as sub-regional mechanisms in the Asia-Pacific and the Indian Ocean region in order to address initiatives and common interests. It says relevant initiatives and common interests, if I'm right. Now, this is very interesting because this mechanism, therefore, can include multiple options that are today, say, emerging in the context of the Indo-Pacific itself. And it's also possible that this initiative can, there are ways to strengthen this initiative in terms of the regional dynamic if ASEAN understands the possibility of that kind of complementarity. Now, where ASEAN is stuck, to my mind, is the geopolitical rivalry among the great powers. Because if you see the situation that is today unfolding in the Indo-Pacific region, that is not due to ASEAN's inability to manage major powers. It is the geopolitical determinants are driven by major power rivalry in the region. So it's interesting that as long as peace prevailed, ASEAN was able to externalize its processes. It was visible. It provided the necessary space for, say, diplomatic processes in the Asia-Pacific, and multiple countries actually sort of signed up to these processes very willingly. Now, the question where I see is in terms of the limits of ASEAN's approach, I think is that we need to actually question whether ASEAN is singularly equipped to handle the structural changes that are happening at the regional level, as well as, and its impact on the global level. So I make the statement very carefully, and I've made it before, much to the displeasure of my ASEAN friends, but by not addressing, like core issues like, say, both preventive diplomacy as well as, say, conflict resolution, what ASEAN has done is to limit itself to the space of just confidence building, which is why several, observers have referred to ASEAN as being a talk shop. And because it's limited itself to this kind of a consultative mechanism, I think its ability to sort of address both preventive diplomacy as well as conflict resolution have been very limited. But if you look at it, there are complementarities where I think are very, very relevant in terms of where ASEAN can meet the newly emerging, I would say, I would call it multiple orders that are emerging in the context of the Indo-Pacific, because there are commonalities where ASEAN's outlook and the position of the Quad actually have several complementarities actually exist. Now, where do I see one of the complementarities is that it is possible for ASEAN and Quad to meet, because ASEAN is also talking about the ability to fit into a normative approach. It is also looking for stakeholders for regional stability in the region constantly. And its primary role, which it has assigned to itself, has been that it considers itself the orchestrator of the regional order in some senses. So it is, I don't think by any means that the Quad countries perceive ASEAN to be irrelevant. And I think Dr. Ray raised this very well in his point when he talked about the Look East policy, the Act East policy, and the shift to the Indian shift to the Indo-Pacific. These three are critically interlinked, and they're also incrementally, they are different from one another. So, and I think that is where it is possible for there to be some kind of complementarities, or you can evolve them between ASEAN and the multiple other orders that are emerging. I'll stop with this, and what we can do is in the next round, perhaps I can come in on some other issues there. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Professor Narayan. And I think in the next round, I'll come to this question of ASEAN centrality once again, because I think that is very critical to our into an Indian understanding of where do we go from here. But let me come to you, Indrani. You have closely studied and looked at this shift from Look East to Act East. And as Dr. Ray was saying, this has been one of the most important elements in the way India has framed the wider Indo-Pacific approach and made this shift. Now, you would recall that at one point in time, there was a great degree of hesitancy in India on the issue of Quad, on the issue of even on Indo-Pacific. There was a reluctance to move to the final frontier, if you will, on this question. But now it seems more or less settled. So if you can just go back and tell us what were some of those reservations that were there, and what are the reasons they have melted away? Is it primarily about China, the elephant in the room, or is there something else going on that I think we need to understand in India's own approach to the region and beyond? Indrani, you're also new.
Thank you, Harsh, and thank you, King's College and India Institute for inviting me. As you rightly said, Harsh, the evolution of India's Indo-Pacific policy came in from, if you look at, say, Quad, what I call Quad 1.0, which started in the aftermath of the tsunami in 2004. It sort of ran aground, if I may, in 2007, 2008, after the first round of Malabar exercises, which involved the US, Japan, Australia, and India, because of Chinese objections. And it was Australia that took the first step out of the Quad, followed by the US. And so we were, the entire notion of the Indo-Pacific returning into the Indian policy space came actually with the Japanese Prime Minister, former Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe, whose statement about the confluence of two seas picked up traction within India, but also within the other countries. And there was a tentative move in around 2016, 2017 to restart. But India was hesitant at that point, because India was trying to build a relationship with China, which it did not want to damage by what it felt may have been a discordant note. So India was actually much more hesitant. The Doklam incident in June 2017, which was preceded by the first BRI forum by China in May of 2017 actually was the first indication that India was going to begin to take a policy shift. In India, if you remember, was the only country to, only major country to not be present at the BRI forum in Beijing. But India actually had a list of 7 reasons why the BRI was a bad idea. It was unprecedented for Indian foreign policy to actually list ways, as you know, as a scholar yourself, you know, Indian foreign policy functions on a set of ambiguities. They stepped out, the Indian government for the first time stepped out of that ambiguous space to list out very carefully why India believed the BRI was would adversely impact Indian interests, certainly Indian security interests. And the Doklam incident, where Chinese forces sort of pushed their way into a tri-junction between Bhutan, India, and China to try and take over that space, thereby impacting India's security in the Northeast. That helped to Turn Indian sentiments even further. This led to while the Prime Minister and President Xi Jinping met in Wuhan in April of 2018 to try and establish some kind of a high-level contact, India made its first statement on the Indo-Pacific at the Shangri La Dialogue in June of 2018, which was referred to by Dr. Ray in his opening remarks. It showed very clearly that India was taking a very different path towards security and towards engagement of the Indo-Pacific and its policy imperatives in the Indo-Pacific. It was then that India laid out very clearly its position on open navigation, on free and open navigation, free commerce, and pushed back against China, particularly after China disregarded the verdict of the PCA on the South China Sea issue in 2016. So that has been the trajectory, but India still continued this 2-track policy. So there was a lot of protestations from Indian diplomats, from Indian ministers, including the Prime Minister, that the Indo-Pacific was just another forum, and they kept the engagement at only a bureaucratic joint secretary or a sort of a senior official level. It did not escalate it any further. There was definitely no question of inviting Australia to the Malabar exercises, which they felt would sort of complete the circuit. India continued its opposition to the BRI, but there was a line that India drew. This continued all the way until 2020. It was Chinese actions in Eastern Ladakh that finally tipped the balance and brought India's Indo-Pacific policy, but more specifically, its Quad policy into sharper focus. We are talking of a Trump administration, which actually picked up on Indo-Pacific and the Quad with a lot of alacrity. And India went along became an enthusiastic partner. Not just that, it became almost a driver of the entire Indo-Pacific and the Quad policies in the last 2 years, I would say. This has taken, on the security front, we have seen a series of swift actions, which culminated, of course, in the first meeting of the foreign ministers of the Quad in Tokyo in October last year. the Australian presence in the Malabar exercises, which they came back to after 2007. And then, of course, the Prime Minister, the Leaders Summit in March this year, and the in-person summit in September. But the trajectory, the journey was sort of perfunctory, if I may, until 2017, 2018. And it was after 2020 that the journey acquired a greater sharpness and a much greater policy push from the Indian government. On the economic front, on the economic and trade front, India walked out of RCEP, and as Ambassador Gurjeet Singh very correctly said, that it would be difficult for India to be part of a trading arrangement in the current context, which has China at the back of it, which India saw saw RCEP as being a free trade agreement with China in disguise, and was not willing to go down that path. And that played into the entire Indo-Pacific Quad policies. The pandemic played a part of its own, because during the pandemic, we discovered that globalization was not what it was, what it said it was going to be, because every country turned to itself, and we discovered that free trade did not mean that people would keep their supply chains open during pandemics. India certainly has felt the impact of price gouging, etc., by suppliers. So the whole idea of resilient supply chains, the whole idea of technology as being the driver of policy, and technology sharing among trusted nations. The key part of the Quad and the Indo-Pacific policy is trust. And if you look at the policies going on, from critical and emerging technologies to healthcare to supply chains, the key word here is trust, and that is what defines not just the larger policy, but the more specific applications of that policy with the Quad and with all these new areas. That I'll stop here, and we can take questions later. Thank you.
Thanks, Dani. I think that's an interesting point about how some of the underlying trends were exacerbated by the pandemic over the last year and a half, and some of those we have seen an acceleration of those trends, and of course its impact on policy. Let me come to you, Admiral Shikhande. On something that I think Indo-Pacific represents for many is this idea that India has finally moved away from its continental mindset to its maritime destiny. Do you see that happening? I mean, we know that, of course, the China threat and the Pakistan challenge post-Afghanistan. But when you look at the operationalization of Indo-Pacific in Indian foreign and security policy, do you see the possibility that the maritime space that somehow, despite in traditional Indian thinkers like Panikkar et al. Saying for a very long time that India's destiny lies in its oceans, that has been sidelined. Do you see this, this engagement now a revival of that trend, or in some ways a resurrection of that idea? Or do you see that, or do you envision that balance that India has struck between the continent and the maritime would continue to divide our energies and to divide our resources and attention?
Thank you, Harsh, and thank you, King's College, for inviting me to be a part of this, superb panel. And the point that you make sort of reminds me of what the other panelists have already spoken. And if I may sort of, link it to Marshall McLuhan's, the medium is the message aspect, in which I would suggest that the Indo-Pacific is both a medium where a lot has happened in centuries past, in fact, and the context of the idea of the Indo-Pacific has changed lesser in the last, millennium actually. But current contexts are also very exciting and very important, and I would say very worrying also. Or the part you said about, so and then there is the messaging, which including Dr. Anupam Ray and all the other speakers have said, what Ms. Bakshi also just mentioned about how the messaging itself is changing on the Indo-Pacific, and that India plays a fairly central role in the messaging part of the Quad, the Indo-Pacific, etc. Could more be done? Of course, a lot more could be done, and I think it is on the anvil, and a lot has been achieved in the last 10 years or so, but especially a lot has changed in the last 2 years. So, and therefore, I think the Indo-Pacific is a space that encompasses, not only the maritime medium, but as it always has, the politics, territorial sovereignty issues, maritime sovereignty issues, climate change, a whole lot of other worries that are now being increasingly recognized in a collaborative and a cooperative manner. And at the center of all this, at the center of the Indo-Pacific, of course, willy-nilly, China has been the glue that has crystallized ideas and crystallized concerns, and therefore led to a lot more cooperation amongst fairly unlike positions that nations had taken before, or in the past 10 years or so, but especially in the past 2 or 3 years, as we see. And therefore, I would say that the Indo-Pacific does remain a maritime medium for India, particularly. You're right. I mean, I agree that in the last 2 years, it seems that our continental issues, security issues, won't go away, but they've always been there and they shall remain. What our maritime sort of outlook can give is the leverages that can enhance the deterrence that is required across the continental and maritime domains, because conflicts do not take place in isolation. They take place in almost all mediums, not necessarily to the same extent. But as a major Indo-Pacific player and as a major constituent of the Quad, as a major constituent of a lot of economic aspects that are going on, and even vaccine diplomacy that is going on, India, I think, has a key role to play. And therefore, in terms of maritime security, I think Dr. Ray, outlined a lot of specific things that are happening. Ms. Bakshi also talked about the Quad, the Malabar exercises that are going on, which have now the Quad constituents, and the need for the Quad itself to expand. What I think the tsunami, as Ambassador Gurpreet Singh was mentioning, the tsunami of 2004 December, in a sense, defined the extent of the Indian Ocean in terms of humanitarian assistance and disaster relief, and how from the easternmost part of the Indian Ocean of Indonesia, literally a wave could rise that impacted on the easternmost extremities of the Indian Ocean, along the Horn of Africa, Somalia, Kenya, etc., including the Seychelles. So it was literally a wave that united us in our concerns for the Indian Ocean. And while initiatives have been going on much before that, we are now looking at the Indian Ocean region as a place where India needs to play a bigger role in a very cooperative way, and that is happening in terms of what Dr. Ray himself enumerated. What has happened now is that Indo-Pacific, because of the Indian Ocean region's consolidation and the Pacific's concern, have united a lot more disparate agencies. And in that, I think a lot was said about the ASEAN. Now, the term ASEAN centrality is, of course, true, but what is ASEAN central for? And therefore, look at what China is doing with ASEAN in terms of just maritime security, in terms of splitting up opinions within ASEAN, making it difficult for ASEAN as a group to negotiate its collective security vis-a-vis a maritime domain with respect to China. Individual members have a problem, and I think India is probably doing a lot bilaterally with individual ASEAN members who in some ways curtail China's moves in the South China Sea, and that is very important for us because South China Sea is probably a central security matter for the Indo-Pacific, as are concerns within the Indian Ocean region. Now, here I would like to point out an emerging concern which is occupying minds all over, and that is the narco trade with its maritime domain that is increasing its potential lethality in a societal, cultural, and economic, and therefore ultimately political manifestations in several nations of the Indo-Pacific, especially the Indian Ocean region itself. So therefore, cooperative maritime security is going to help us offset some of the moves by China and some of the moves that are happening, some of the outcomes that are happening as a result of what may be happening in Afghanistan and Pakistan, etc., as far as narcotics go. And therefore, coming back to the original point you were making, is that an increasing maritime India will probably ease the pressures that we feel in terms of our continental strategy itself. And therefore, at the construct of the DIME, that is diplomatic, informational, military, and economic, several things that are happening in terms of the Quad, in terms of the Indo-Pacific, in terms of our engagement with ASEAN, in terms of our growing trade, which Ambassador Gurjeet Singh pointed out, it is phenomenal that dependence on the South China Seas, the South China Sea and East China Sea being part of a rules-based international order, for which China is actually a spoiler. How does it all come to create an element of greater deterrence against China that India needs to balance the continental as well as the maritime? And China itself has, I think, taken initiatives. Some of them are not turning out to be very great because I think strategically there may be a problem. But look at the BRI itself, as one of the speakers mentioned. It's a great synthesis of the continental and the maritime, except that it is creating greater security concerns globally and reducing them, including for China. And that, I think, is China's major problem. And therefore, Quad, the Indo-Pacific, the ASEAN, all together can actually do a lot in the maritime domain, so that the maritime domain as a medium creates a message that is felt even territorially across, because finally people live on land and not at sea. And but the Indo-Pacific as a maritime medium can play a great role in quelling some of the fires that could possibly arise, but for which you can see embers already spread all over, and that should be a worry. I'll stop.
Thank you, Admiral. Now, in the first part of this conversation, we, in almost all our, entire part of this conversation was largely about the drivers for the Indo-Pacific, and I would like to now come to the, to some of the constraints, which is part of this conversation as well. So, Ambassador Singh, if I can start with you, and you mentioned some of them earlier on. I think you mentioned economic aspect in particular being a major constraint going forward. But as you look at the Indo-Pacific concept, the idea which is now being accepted across the board, some in limited forms like the ASEAN, but if you look at the Western nations, including Britain, for example, embracing Indo-Pacific and trying to become a major Indo-Pacific player, France and even Germany coming out with an Indo-Pacific policy, and Netherlands. So you have European countries, America, of course, and then you have a whole host of countries in the region which are trying to shift the discourse in a particular direction. What are some of the challenges that you foresee for countries like India as they operationalize this policy more concretely on the ground? Some of the aspects were mentioned by Dr. Ray in terms of what India was trying to do in the maritime space. But beyond that, as you look at the institutional frameworks, as you look at the economic architecture, do you see a situation where our aspirations probably are moving faster than our ability to shape those aspirations?
Thank you. I think the biggest challenge is concept of ASEAN centrality. I think Admiral rightly asked the question. I think Shankari is so well versed in it. The problem is that ASEAN always wants to be central, but never wants to take responsibility for it. When I was ambassador to ASEAN, my constant question was, yes, you are central. When will you be responsible? So they are an irresponsible power or irresponsible. In fact, they are not a power at all. That's the second problem with ASEAN. They lack power. They are not a power organization. They are not a realist organization. So when China challenged them in a realist manner, they didn't know what to do. They just caved in, creating problems for countries like India, Japan, and Australia. So ASEAN is now an undependable realist power. It is part of the structure, but we are cajoling it along. And if you don't believe me, I'll tell you when the Biden administration took over, they forgot about ASEAN. It took them a long time to realize that ASEAN exists and we need to get back to it. And then you had the defense secretary and the vice president going to some ASEAN countries and making up with them. And India, I mean, you read Dr. Jayashankar's book, he says in just one phrase, ASEAN centrality is not what it used to be. Finished. End of ASEAN. Now, today, when you look at the Quad 1 summit and the Quad 2 summit, we have elaborated this ASEAN centrality concept. Why? Because we realize that the heart, what Dr. Surin, as Shangri pointed out, in 2000, the heart of the Indo-Pacific is ASEAN. You can't let 10 countries go to China on a walkover. So you have to think again. So the Americans have thought again. We always spoke about ASEAN centrality, but to be honest, we also didn't know what to do with it other than talk about it. So today the Quad is giving handouts to ASEAN like we would to African countries. Free vaccines, take more vaccines. Australia is funding 500,000. Japan is funding 3 billion. India is funding 500,000. Why is ASEAN in this situation? Their GDPs are not that weak. All ASEAN countries are not CLMP countries. Yet most of them, other than Singapore, are sitting in this thing. Oh, everybody is attracted to us. And so we are central, but do nothing. That is the biggest constraint. Dr. Ray correctly pointed out, we have more than 30 mechanisms with ASEAN. And today I attended a symposium on the trilateral highway. Everything is India's responsibility. Thailand does nothing. Not $1 is spent by them. All these 30 mechanisms, India spends all the money. ASEAN puts in nothing. This is not an equal partnership, therefore unsustainable. Secondly, RCEP. ASEAN let India down badly. When China had to be stopped in the negotiations, our friends in ASEAN promised that they would speak up. And other than Japan, no ASEAN country spoke up. Therefore, we had to quit in 2019. Today, Japanese still say India needed back because to balance China. ASEAN is not in the same boat as India. India is afraid we'll be overrun by Chinese imports. ASEAN is already overrun by Chinese imports. So they are not in the same boat as us. ASEAN wants to know what investment can we bring, just as we want to know what investment we can bring. India today, while talking about ASEAN centrality, still sees ASEAN as a bad economic partner. They did not implement the FTA fairly. And today, when we talk to Japan and Australia about the supply chain resilience initiative, we don't want ASEAN anywhere in it. Impractical perhaps, but that is the reality. India wants investment to come to it and not be diverted to ASEAN. But this makes the problem. How are you going to have supply chains without ASEAN? So this is where you come to the hard fact. India today wants supply chains with Japan, USA, Europe, Australia. And we will treat ASEAN as a market in which we should be able to compete with China. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. And I know Shankri would want to also address some of these questions. But Shankri, because we might be coming to an end also very soon, I would also raise this point with you. In terms of academia, there are two parts. One, of course, you address the ASEAN centrality question as well, given your own work on ASEAN and India. But also, I would like you to address this question of how is the academia prepared to engage with the Indo-Pacific, and given how fast it has come and how fast it has been embraced by the policymaking community, are we lagging behind as academics, or are we there yet in terms of confronting the academic challenge that is in front of us?
Can you hear me? Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Thank you so much, Harsh. I think I'll just start first and foremost with this centrality question that Ambassador Gurjeet also referred to. I think Admiral also referred to it. And the entire focus on how, let me just say that the entire focus on how ASEAN centrality developed is an externally driven one. It was never ASEAN that drove its centrality. What happened is that, as you see, I would call this basically an agenda setting kind of a approach that ASEAN had. In the early years when ASEAN formation took place, what you see is that because of the external environment, ASEAN was under pressure to sort of formulate certain measures which would ensure the insulation of the region from the influence of major powers. And I think that's where Ambassador Gurjeet actually raised a very valid point. He says, what happens to these 10 countries right in the heart of the Indo-Pacific? Can they just be overridden by China? Now, this question, when the context of having to establish certain normative practices came early on during the Cold War, ASEAN chose to have concepts like the ZOPFAN, which is the freedom, neutrality, peace, freedom, zone of peace, freedom, and neutrality. It initiated what you call the Treaty of Amity and Cooperation, which subsequently became a conditionality for entry into the EAS. Then you have the Southeast Asia nuclear weapons free zone. Now, if you take all these were basically designed to protect these, at that point, the original 5 countries, and then subsequently Brunei joined, but to protect this region from the context of great power rivalry. This was its primary role. Now, the question of centrality then became thrust upon ASEAN as the Cold War ended. And when did it happen? When the ARF formation came into existence. Now, the ARF's idea never came from within ASEAN. It came from both Canada and Australia, because it was identified that on the lines of the OSCE in Europe, we should have a framework for security, a multilateral security plan for the Asia-Pacific region. Not wanting to stay out of that debate, ASEAN literally offered itself to join within the context of ASEAN's mechanisms. Again, the same old pillars, consultation, consensus. That's exactly where the change in ASEAN has not come. And I completely agree that ASEAN is not a reliable partner as far as India is concerned, either in terms of economics or in terms of the security debate. So it is sad, because while I am very clear that there is the eastward expansion of India's engagement has happened from ASEAN, and I think at some point even our foreign minister Yashwant Sinha had said this as early as 2003. He says that this is the pivot from which India will engage eastwards. So this was in his Harvard lecture. So it's interesting to see that this concept of centrality was actually thrust upon ASEAN from an externally driven perspective, especially because it was viewed that if they could engage all the great powers in the aftermath of the Cold War, then this whole concept of socializing great powers into the ASEAN way, I mean, we've had much literature come out on this entire discussion on the ASEAN way and how you socialize ASEAN. I think the caveat here is important for us to understand. The Chinese use the ASEAN way in order to socialize ASEAN into a Chinese way. And I'm putting it very, very bluntly here. Now, how do I see this? We've talked about the South China Sea. People have referred to the entire debate of the South China Sea. People have referred to the entire debate of the, what happened, how the Chinese have quite constantly behaved. Now, if you take three indicators, let me give you the 1990, when you had Li Peng's visit to normalize relations with Southeast Asia, because between 65 and 1990, Indonesia and Asia and China did not have relations with each other. They did not have diplomatic relations. So when the normalization of relations happened, the Chinese agreed in principle to do joint exploration of the South China Sea areas, Spratlys, Paracels, you name it. Now, systematically, by 2002, a decade later, again, the trade relations had become extremely vital between ASEAN and China. And then finally, the Chinese talked about the declaration on a code of conduct which was non-binding, which is the 2002 agreement. Systematically, give it another 10 years, which 2012, when that decade was to change the DOC to a more binding COC, what did the Chinese do? They stopped the entire discussion on the South China Sea within the ASEAN summit, okay? So the question of centrality is, again, I think extremely critical, because it is important to recognize that this mechanism that was there for the larger region is no longer viable, because it does not have any kind of a framework that can address the China's excesses in the region. There has been no reference to Chinese aggressions in the South China Sea. And I think this is also, much of this is because of the fact that the levers of economic ties between ASEAN and China lie in the hands of the Chinese. Now, let me give you an example. If you see what has happened in the post-COVID period and the kind of bilateral relations between Australia and China that have deteriorated, you can clearly understand the extent of punitive measures that China is capable of in terms of the kind of trade relations they have had with Australia. Now, if ASEAN were to suffer this context of the trade relations with China, there would be absolute chaos in the region, which is well recognized by the ASEAN members. The second thing I wanted to sort of point out is that when you talked about the centrality debate, centrality has never been a given as far as ASEAN is concerned. Centrality of ASEAN has always been more of a dynamic concept rather than a static one. Okay, centrality has changed with time. There have been times when multiple, and you see this even in the beginning when the Cambodian conflict happened, ASEAN countries were divided on how they viewed China and how they viewed Vietnam, because at that time, the entire context was revolving around the Vietnamese intervention in Cambodia. Now, significantly, even today, I still recall in 2018, it was Marty Natlagawa who raised this entire question of ASEAN being in a state of strategic drift, okay? Now, it's interesting that though they are tied together, there is pulls and pressures on ASEAN because it comprises of 10 members, okay? And nowhere can I give you a better example than the AUKUS deal that has now currently gone on, because that has actually brought clear distinctions and what you call the differences among individual ASEAN members to the forefront. So I think the centrality question is never static. It is a constantly evolving, dynamic kind of a question, which it has a relevance in terms of being able to provide a consultative forum, but beyond consultation, it has not succeeded at all. The second question, I think, Harsh, that you're sort of raising with me is the entire question on, are we there yet? That's a wonderful question to answer. I'm not yet sure we're there yet, because if you look at the academic discourse, okay, there are these tightly contained, okay, I'll go into describing how in my own center, we decided to rename this as the Center for Indo-Pacific Studies, okay? Now, though we renamed it as the Center for Indo-Pacific Studies, we do not look at the Western Indian Ocean. We focus purely on India's eastward engagement, which is Southeast Asia and the Pacific. Now, if you take, for example, the Center for African Studies, focus on the Western Indian Ocean, or if you take the Center for West Asian Studies, the focus is on the Western Indian Ocean. The point is that the integration of the academic structures are not as smoothly done and is not as, they don't complement each other in the Indian system, at least so far, because you are still in these tightly compartmentalized sort of centers and study areas. But the one good thing is that the focus on an Indo-Pacific conference no longer is limited to Southeast Asia or the Pacific from an Indian context. Okay, it does bring in, scholars from Africa. For example, I've done a book on how, I've done a chapter for a book that came out of from South Africa, MISTRA basically, South Africa, which was on the geopolitics and how Africa fits into this new geopolitical domain, with a focus on the Indo-Pacific, with a focus on whether the IORA can broaden the scope and how the ASEAN's framework can contribute towards multilateralism in this region. So there is an increasing sense, I would say, of bringing different disciplines or different area studies. I would not even call it different disciplines, but different aspects of area studies together in order to sort of broad base the approach to understanding the disciplinary aspects of an Indo-Pacific kind of a framework. So this is a mega region. We cannot forget that even as this is a mega region, there will be subunits and specializations will emerge in the subunit kind of framework, but and you will have the systemic level analysis that is being done at the mega regional kind of a level, which we're seeing now, because everybody is today talking about an approach to the Indo-Pacific, which is the systemic level. But if you go below the systemic level to the subunits and the subunits, then you will see that area studies will still remain kind of relevant as far as the academic aspect is concerned. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Sundaraman. And we have a few minutes left, and I would, Indrani, I'll come to you, after Admiral Srikhande for the last comment, because there I want to weave in Indian politics as well, and then see if there are any differences there. But Admiral Srikhande, there is a question here from one of our viewers saying, who wants to ask particularly. Who's a student in Delhi University, asking about Chinese engagement with the island states in the Western Indian Ocean in particular. And I think he wants to, to seek your views on, especially on the securitization of Chinese investment in ports and infrastructure, the larger issue of Maritime Silk Road and its implications for India in particular. And I think this is a question that many in India have asked, and many Indian naval analysts and others have engaged with for a while. How do you see this development, and how do you foresee India breaking this so-called string of pearls initiative? And do you see this as something that is in some ways a concrete manifestation of Chinese ambitions, or is it purely about economics and Chinese desire to expand its economic footprint?
Thanks, Harsh. I think it's a very important question that really spans, all politics, economics, and in a narrower sense, military issues itself. And I have I cannot conceive of a runway or a pier in a port that can be used only by merchant ships and never by warships in theory or practice. For the bollards on a jetty, it doesn't matter where the ropes are coming from. So every facility that is created, especially if it is accompanied by political and diplomatic pressures that China can bring, is therefore a dual use potentially. Now, the fact that there is at this stage no outright need for any such dual use is a secondary matter, but the potential is always there. So whatever term anybody wants to use, whether it's a string of pearls or whatever connotation or concoction, the fact is that China's maritime presence in terms of not only its partnerships in building ports, but its entire spread of merchant ship construction, merchant ship ownership, maritime insurance, maritime financing, and global involvement in in trade, and all the finances that are related to global trade itself are a matter of great concern. What is happening in the Western Indian Ocean region, along the coast of Africa, etc., is very important. And I think it is important that India itself tries to see the Indian Ocean region as a more composite entity which connects, like Professor Sundaraman mentioned, that there could be a problem of an Institute of Indian Ocean Studies which looks east rather than looks west as well as east, south as well as north, in terms of the continental connectivities we have. So therefore, now of course you have to focus on certain areas. Certain people have to focus on areas, but who's knitting the picture together? And I think in that aspect, probably India is now at a stage of doing this job of knitting all these pictures or all these pieces together into a neater picture of statecraft than we have done hitherto. And that is somewhere I think Beijing has done better than most nations in the past. There are potential fault lines for Beijing. It is for them to see what we can do in terms of ports, etc. It is a worry, and what India needs to do is not to duplicate all those efforts, but to really use all the other sinews of statecraft to create deeper friendships and deeper cooperation amongst all partners, and the greater confidence. And this is where what Ms. Bhakti was mentioning. China has a trust deficit that began some time back, but I think in the last 2 or 3 years they've done a remarkable job of eroding trust globally. No nation has eroded trust faster in so short span of time than Beijing seems to have done. Not desirably from their point of view, but that seems to be the outcome. And I think we need to take advantage of that lack of trust and build the trust that is required amongst all partners, and especially the Indian Ocean region itself. Whether it is the rims, the Bay of Bengal, as you mentioned, I think in your opening remarks itself, that consolidation is required. Thanks.
Thank you, Indrani. Two questions. One is, something that Shangri mentioned about academic structures. I would come to you for and Dr. Ray mentioned some of the institutional changes that MEA has witnessed in recent times, whether it's the Indo-Pacific division or other such issues. Do you see an institutional change or institutional architecture being created both within India and in the region to be able to deal with the challenges that are emerging from the Indo-Pacific? Because if you look at the Indo-Pacific as a maritime space, well, we have not really thought of this maritime space in a very long time, despite its ancient lineage. So therefore, we need to create institutions, both domestically and regionally, to manage the transition that is happening. Are we there yet? That's a question that I asked Shankari as well, in terms of both within India as well as in the region. You mentioned a few things like Quad, etc. But what would you need to do more than just Quad or Quad plus? Are we looking at some of those changes more granularly than we have done in the past? And secondly, because I think we are in an India Institute set up, is there enough domestic political consensus on this issue, or are there domestic fault lines on this issue as well? Do you see the China factor now becoming, or the China threat perception becoming so huge that we are domestically aligned in a certain way? Because in the past, we know on the China issue, we have had enormous debates, like on all issues in India. We have debated it endlessly. Do you see that debate ending in certain way, or do you still see certain fault lines in the way foreign policy, Indo-Pacific policy will evolve over the next few years? Do you see those fault lines yet, or are there any fault lines of that kind? Do you foresee any of those emerging in the future, or have we, or has that boat sailed and we are in a position where we can now look at a more national policy on this issue across political parties, across ideologies?
Right. Thanks, Harsh. To your first question about institutions, as Anupam mentioned, that the MEA has sort of built a division called the Indo-Pacific Division, but I don't think that's enough. Honestly, it is India's diplomatic and strategic footprint is growing faster than it can cope with. And I think we have to understand, we have to deal with that sooner rather than later. Every government has pushed this particular can down the road. This government has flirted with consultants and lateral entries at lower levels. But the fact is they haven't got to the heart of it, which is they have to build institutions within government that bring together certain the strands that drive our Indo-Pacific policy, or the Quad, or even the Indian Ocean policy. For instance, the Commerce Ministry with MEA, with naval, with the security services, with the armed services. We don't have that synergy, and that synergy is absolutely vital, because what you're dealing with today are cross-disciplinary issues. So, for instance, why did you get out of RCEP? Why did we even negotiate RCEP for 7-8 years? And why did the red flags not come up earlier? The nation was absolutely stunned when they walked away from RCEP, and I think only 5 people in New Delhi knew why they walked away from RCEP. But so there is a problem in Indian governments, regardless of their politics, with building institutions to put your foreign policy imperatives forward. And I would say that is important, because in this current scenario, our domestic policies are increasingly interlinked with our foreign policy. You could say that was true earlier too, but I think we're looking at a time which is much more interlinked today. For instance, if you're doing vaccines in India, I mean, you started out, you just look at the fiasco with the vaccines, the vaccine exports. I mean, we were doing beautifully exporting vaccines and with the vaccine diplomacy, but somebody within the Indian system did not do the math about vaccines for Indians. So they had to stop the exports, and that led to a credibility deficit, that led to a reputational deficit. These are things that will continue to happen until we build more robust, more shall we say, interoperable institutions within the Indian government. And I don't think we are there yet. So that's on the institutional front. On the political front, yes, I think the fault lines, especially on China, have blurred, have been, because I think what happened in Galwan last year, or just watching the aggression and the expansionist behavior of the Chinese in Eastern Ladakh and in other areas, I think the political divides between political parties on China have dulled to a great extent. I don't think there is a political party that will survive by saying, oh, let's go make nice with the Chinese, even while we haven't yet resolved the issue in Eastern Ladakh. I don't think there will be that. And I don't think there will be another government, whoever it is, coming in to not build the resilience, the domestic resilience, to be able to deal with Chinese aggression on the economic and the supplies front. So I believe that we may not be like Washington DC, but we are close in that the main political parties are more or less understanding of and more or less sympathetic to our China policy or our response to Chinese actions.
Thank you, Indrani. Before we go, there are 2 questions. If I can address them to Ambassador Singh. Ambassador, very quickly, if you can respond to 2 of these questions which have been raised by our viewers. One is on India's technological priorities in the Indo-Pacific, especially in the context of US-China rivalry in the technological domain, and the other is about India's position on the western side of its periphery. That is the Act West policy, I think. Think West policy.
West.
Think West, yes. So that is the Gulf, because that is also, according to India's definition, that is the wider part of our Indo-Pacific. So on just these two questions on technological frontier as well as on India's approach towards the Middle East, or what we call West Asia.
Thank you, Dr. Bhatt. So I think over the years, India's prowess in IT services has been well noted in Southeast Asia. And whether it is Indonesia or Philippines or Thailand, everywhere, there is a strong Indian presence. And Indian, unicorns are participating now in ASEAN economies. Even the startups are going there, and even the impact investors from India are investing in ASEAN. So I think there is a good thing happening there, mostly untouched by government, which perhaps helps it to succeed. The second aspect is, now if you look at the Quad initiative, now whether it is vaccines or 5G or AI or big data or whatever. So what India is trying to say is that with the help of our partners, we are going to be big players. And we want ASEAN as a market. This point I was emphasizing earlier. And we will challenge China with the help of our partners in these fields. We are not primary movers on these technologies, but I think we need to be bigger participants and do that. I think that is on the technology side. On the West Asia side, I think this is a great achievement of this government, that they have lured many of the West Asian countries away from a Pakistan-India syndrome to an India syndrome, which is more participative and realist, rather than look at the Islamic factor. This, and you see the other day what they call the alternative Quad between UAE, Israel, and India. So this is, India's close relationship with the USA has allowed us to come closer to many US allies, including Israel, and after the Abraham Accords with Saudi Arabia and UAE. So I think this will lead to greater role for India in these countries. And if Israel, along with Japan, Australia, USA, can invest in new technologies in India, we will become the source of providing those technologies outside and the services based on.
Thank you. We have run out of time. In fact, we have exceeded the time, but it was a fantastic discussion, and we touched upon several aspects of Indo-Pacific in a matter of hour and a half, in less than an hour. So thank you all, and special thanks to Dr. Ray, Ambassador Singh, Indrani, Shankri, and Rear Admiral Shrikande for this very granular discussion on a topic that I think few of us are yet to get our heads around. But this is the first of a series of conversations we plan to hold. And thank you to all our participants who were patiently with us for the entire duration. Louise, over to you if you want to conclude.
Just to say a huge thank you to all of our panelists. It has been a really edifying and informative discussion, and I hope you may stay with us on our journey with some further conversations too. So a big thank you to all of you, and to our audience as well.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Good to see all of you. Thank you.